The doctors called it a contained gravitational anomaly. That was the polite name, the name written on the discharge form they handed me the morning they sent me home to die. Dr. Fenwick said it with the practiced calm of a man who had delivered terminal diagnoses before, though I suspected not many like this one. A micro-singularity had taken root inside my chest cavity, lodged between the fourth and fifth rib, approximately 3 centimeters from my heart. It was growing. Slowly. Slowly enough that I had 7 days before it would reach critical mass and consume me from the inside out. 7 days. I remember looking at the readout on his display screen and thinking, clinically, the way a quantum systems engineer thinks. That is a containment window, not a death sentence. There is a difference. A containment window implies parameters. Parameters imply variables. Variables imply room to work. That was 55 loops ago. I'm going to try to explain what that means, and I want you to understand that I am not a woman given to drama. I have spent 31 years of my working life solving problems that most of my colleagues considered unsolvable. I led the team that stabilized the Kepler-4 relay. I mapped the resonance cascade that destroyed Outpost Meridian before anyone else even knew the cascade was possible. I do not exaggerate. I do not catastrophize. When I tell you that what I lived through was the loneliest, most exhausting, most maddening thing a human being has ever endured, I am giving you the most conservative estimate I can manage. I will start at the beginning. Station Aethon sits in a degraded orbit above the inner belt, roughly 400 kilometers above the refinery platforms that process the ore the haulers bring up from the asteroid runs. It is not a beautiful station. It was never meant to be beautiful. It is a working research platform, all exposed conduit and recycled atmosphere, the kind of place where the coffee is always burnt, and the artificial gravity runs about 6% low in the portside corridors, so that everybody walks with a slight lean they stop noticing after the first week. I had lived there for 9 years. I knew every sound it made. I knew the way the hull contracted at 300 station time when the radiators cycled down. A low metallic complaint like the station was settling in for the night. I knew which pressure doors stuck, and which environmental panels had been repaired so many times that the replacement parts were themselves replacements of replacements. I knew where the insulation had thinned in the main research corridor, which made the corridor 10 degrees colder than anywhere else, and which everyone who worked there compensated for by keeping a second jacket on their chair. I knew it the way you know a place you never expected to love. The anomaly did not come from inside the station. That much the forensic analysis eventually confirmed, though the confirmation came too late to matter in any practical sense. It came from the exterior array, the exotic matter containment lattice we had been running at 80% capacity for the better part of a year, pushing the upper limits of what the regulating bodies permitted because the project director, a man named Halst, had decided that the results justified the risk. He had not consulted me on that decision. He rarely consulted me on anything, though I was the one who had flagged the resonance irregularities in the lattice 6 months prior and been told, politely, to return to my assigned work. The anomaly seated itself in my chest while I was running a standard maintenance check on the secondary array. I did not feel it happen. There was no pain, no warning, no moment of decision or significance. One moment I was calibrating a sensor cluster in the access corridor, nodding in my log that emitter housing 7 had a microfracture in the mounting bracket that would need attention. The next, 18 hours later, I was lying on a medical bay table while Dr. Fenwick told me I was going to die. I did not believe him at first. That is the honest truth. I heard the words and my mind went immediately to the engineering problem, the variables, the containment window. I asked him for the growth rate data. He gave it to me. I ran the numbers in my head while he was still talking, still doing the thing doctors do when they are trying to give you room to absorb catastrophic information, speaking slowly and watching your face for signs of shock. 7 days was, in fact, the upper bound on a generous estimate. 5 was more likely, given the rate of acceleration in the first 12 hours. He sent me home because there was nothing else to do. The micro-singularity was too deeply embedded for any surgical intervention he could conceive of. Any attempt to physically remove or disrupt it would accelerate the accretion cascade rather than interrupt it. Halst authorized compassionate release. My quarters on the station were a standard-issue bunk room with a porthole view of the refinery platforms, and I spent the first loop, the original loop, the one I did not know was a loop, lying on my bunk, watching the slow orange glow of the platforms and running equations in my head that I knew had no solution. I say I knew they had no solution. What I mean is that I kept running them anyway. That is probably the most honest thing I can tell you about myself. I am a woman who runs equations that have no solution because the alternative is not running them, and not running them is not something I know how to do. On the 5th day, I was on my bunk again when the singularity reached a threshold. I felt it then. A pulling sensation deep in the chest, not painful so much as total, the feeling of something in you demanding that everything around it also become it. Not localized, not a cramp or a pressure, something that was simultaneously precise and everywhere at once, like the concept of gravity made suddenly personal. I understood in that moment, with the precise and terrible clarity of someone who had spent 3 decades thinking about exotic matter, exactly what was happening. I reached into the pocket of my work jacket and found the capsule I had been carrying for 23 years. I need to explain the capsule. When I was a junior researcher at the Holbein Institute, 23 years old, newly posted, still learning the difference between theoretical and applied quantum physics in the most practical possible way, I found it in a storage locker I had been assigned. It was in a small unmarked container, sitting behind a box of calibration tools. A single capsule, approximately the size of a vitamin, translucent amber, with no markings whatsoever. I had run every non-destructive analysis I could think of and gotten readings that did not match any known compound in any database I had access to. It was not toxic. It was not inert. The spectrometry results were internally inconsistent in ways that suggested the compound was doing something to the measurement process itself, that the act of analyzing it was changing its apparent properties. I kept it because that is what you do when you are 23 years old and you find something that defies your instruments. You keep it. You put it on the shelf above your workstation, and you think about it periodically for 2 decades, and you never quite resolve whether it is something extraordinary or simply a mislabeled residue of a discontinued experiment that predated the lab's current filing system. I swallowed it on the 5th day of dying, because I had nothing else left to try and no particular reason not to. I woke up on a medical bay table. Dr. Fenwick was telling me I was going to die. The readout on his screen showed a micro-singularity, 3 centimeters from my heart, 7 days to critical mass. My hand went immediately to my pocket. The capsule was there. I had no memory of the past 5 days. I had no memory of the capsule going down, no memory of the pulling sensation, no memory of whatever had happened in the space between swallowing and waking. I had the capsule, and I had the discharge form, and I had 7 days that I had already spent once. It took me the better part of the second loop to understand what had happened. The capsule did not cure the anomaly. It did not stop the growth. It did not provide any relief whatsoever from the fundamental problem, which was that a gravitational parasite had taken up residence in my chest and was consuming me from the inside. What the capsule did, what I eventually determined, after enough loops and enough failed experiments to fill a research archive 3 times over, was return me to a specific fixed point in my own personal timeline. The moment I had been handed the discharge form. The moment I had walked out of the medical bay with 7 days and no plan, and the stubborn, impractical conviction that there had to be a variable I had not yet identified. Over and over. I will not pretend the early loops were productive. The first 3 after I understood what was happening, I spent in a kind of paralysis that I am not proud of, doing what the dying do. Sitting with my family, eating meals I would never remember, watching my daughter practice the piano in the common room while I ran numbers in my head that refused to resolve. My husband Donald is a patient man, slower to panic than I am, slower to everything than I am, which has always been one of the reasons I loved him in the specific way that you love someone who is genuinely different from you rather than a mirror of your own qualities. He knew something was wrong. He always knows when something is wrong. He did not press. He made bad coffee and sat across from me at the small table in our quarters and talked about ordinary things, the hauler schedule, a book he was reading, something our daughter had said, and gave me the space of his calm without ever nomming what he was giving me. In those early loops I kept trying to tell him. Every time I tried, the words fell apart in my mouth, because how do you explain to a patient, gentle man that the woman he married is dying and has already died repeatedly, and that she is going to die again in approximately 7 days, and that there is no version of this he can help with, no problem he can carry for her, nothing his steadiness can fix? You cannot. The sentence does not complete. I would start it, I would say his name, I would say there is something I need to tell you, and he would look at me with that particular quality of attention he has, fully present, no agenda, and the words would stop. You do not explain it. You eat dinner. You watch your daughter play piano. You go to sleep in your bunk with the porthole view and the orange glow of the refinery platforms, and you wait for your chest to betray you. I found Paula on the 12th loop. Her full name was Dr. Paula Nars, and she was a postgraduate researcher in temporal mechanics, 26 years old, recently assigned to Aethon's auxiliary physics bay. I had walked past her office 100 times without registering her in any meaningful way. I had cataloged her as one of the station's rotating postgraduate population, filed under faces I recognized but had not engaged with. On the 12th loop, 3 days in, I was walking through the research wing in a state of barely contained frustration. I had spent 2 full loops attempting to reverse engineer the capsule using the station's mass spectrometry suite, and had gotten readings that contradicted themselves in ways I could not explain. The compound behaved differently in analysis depending on the orientation of the sensor array, which implied either a fundamental flaw in my methodology or a property that should not have been physically possible, and I had not yet determined which. I was walking the corridor with my head down, and my mind 6 removes from my body, and I glanced through a porthole into her office and stopped. It was a diagram pinned to the wall behind her workstation, a resonance map of the type produced by exotic matter decay, the concentric interference rings, the propagation vectors, the probability density overlay that you only produce if you are thinking about temporal distortion as a physical substrate rather than a theoretical abstraction. I had drawn maps like that myself, years ago, before the applied work had crowded out the theoretical. Before I had started working on things that could be built rather than things that could only be imagined. I knocked on the door. She looked up. She was younger than she looked in the corridor, up close, bright eyes behind wire-framed readers she probably did not need for correction, but wore out of habit, the kind of habit that started in graduate seminars when you wanted to project a certain variety of seriousness. She had the particular expression of someone who had been interrupted in the middle of a thought she was afraid of losing, the very specific mild irritation of a mind pulled back from somewhere it had been going without a map. I told her I was Dr. Zara Voss. I told her I had an anomaly in my chest, and a capsule I could not identify, and a resonance problem that was going to kill me in 4 days. I told her I needed to understand temporal inversion at a molecular level, and that I suspected she might be the only person on this station who had thought seriously about the physical substrate of time as something that could be locally disrupted rather than simply measured. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "Close the door." That was the beginning of the part that might, in a generous retelling, be called the collaboration. In practice, it was more like two people throwing themselves at a wall repeatedly and trying different angles. Paula had the theoretical foundation. She had spent 4 years working on what she called temporal matter mechanics, the study of time not as a dimension but as a medium, something particles and fields and information moved through the way sound moved through atmosphere, subject to compression and reflection, and under specific exotic conditions, reversal. The math was extraordinary. I had worked in exotic matter research for a decade and a half, and I had not seen anyone approach the problem from that angle, with that level of formal rigor. She had not had access to empirical data because temporal inversion was not, officially, something that happened. The research committee that controlled Aethon's experimental budget had twice declined her proposals on the grounds that the phenomenon she was studying had not been demonstrated to exist. She was pursuing it anyway, on her own time, with her own equipment, because researchers like Paula do not stop working on a problem, because the funding committee does not believe in it. They work on it more quietly. I gave her the empirical data, 55 versions of it eventually. The anomaly was the central problem, and the central problem with the anomaly was that it was not a technology. It was not an enemy you could outmaneuver, or a system you could shut down, or a threat you could threaten back. It was physics. Gravitational accretion is not malicious. It does not negotiate. It does not tire. It does not feel the passage of time or register that the woman it is consuming has now lived through her own death 55 times and is running low on patience and capsules. A micro-singularity growing inside a human chest does not care that the human has a daughter who is afraid to play piano in front of people, or a husband who makes terrible coffee and always gets the ratio wrong but has never once complained about waking up at 500 when his wife cannot sleep. It does not care about any of it. It accretes. It expands. It obeys the same equations it has always obeyed, on whatever scale it finds itself, from the collapse of stars down to the slow consumption of one stubborn researcher in a degraded orbit station above the inner belt. The universe does not register any of that. The universe runs on equations. I had spent my career believing that was enough, that the equations were the point, that if you could work out the variables, you could solve the problem, that the problem was always, in the end, a problem of variables. By the 28th loop, I was beginning to understand that the problem I was actually trying to solve was not the one I had been working on. Let me describe the parasite properly, because I want you to understand what we were dealing with. A micro-singularity is not like anything in ordinary experience. It has no biology in any conventional sense, no metabolism, no behavior that could be called intentional or directed. But it has something that functions like appetite, in that it is always accreting mass, always drawing matter toward itself, always expanding through the body's density at the rate physics allows. Once seated in a host body, it grows using the difference between the host's mass distribution and its own increasing gravitational pull to feed the accretion cycle. It is a self-sustaining process. It does not require external fuel. It uses the host as both medium and food. The host body does not know it is happening until the threshold is reached, and by then it is too late for anything except an equation that has only one solution. The exotic matter research on Aethon, Halst's project, the one he had pushed past the safety margins month after month, because the preliminary results were extraordinary and the funding timeline was not, had created exactly the right conditions for seeding. A resonance cascade in the containment lattice had produced a bubble of compressed spacetime roughly the diameter of a standard issue maintenance corridor. The compression bubble had existed for approximately 9 seconds before the automated safeties detected it and triggered a partial array shutdown. 9 seconds was long enough. I had walked through it while it existed, because I had been running a maintenance check on the secondary array at the exact wrong moment, and the bubble had seeded a micro-singularity in my chest, with the same indifference that a piece of shrapnel seeds itself in the body of someone who happened to be standing in the wrong place when something exploded. The compression bubble had since dissipated. The seed it had left behind had not. What Paula and I eventually determined, over the course of 12 loops of increasingly systematic joint research, was that the capsule was not returning me to a fixed temporal coordinate. It was returning me to a fixed state of matter coordinate. The precise molecular arrangement of my body at the moment I had been handed the discharge form, before the singularity had reached measurable threshold growth. The singularity was present in every reset, dormant for a few days, then accreting, then killing me, then reset. The capsule could not reach what it could not measure, and the singularity at the reset point was below measurable threshold. The capsule was, in effect, a reset that changed everything except the thing that mattered. The problem was that viable did not mean cured. I still had the seed. Every loop I had the seed. The capsule could reset me 1,000 times, and 1,000 times the seed would still be there, growing on schedule, burning through the window, forcing me back to the reset point with nothing solved and one capsule gone. The loop was not a solution. The loop was a holding pattern, and a holding pattern only works until you run out of fuel. Fuel in this analogy was the capsule supply. I had found the original capsule alone in that container. 1. There was no manufacturer, no source, no documentation in any archive I could access that described a compound with those properties. On the 31st loop, I ran out. I sat in my bunk watching the refinery platforms and felt the singularity reaching threshold and understood, with a clarity that was almost peaceful, that I was about to die for the last time. I thought about all the loops I had spent. I thought about Paula and the resonance maps. I thought about Donald's bad coffee and my daughter's hesitation before the difficult passage. I thought, this is an unacceptable outcome. That is not bravery. I want to be clear about that. It was not courage, and it was not heroism, and it was not anything that deserves a particular name. It was just the specific stubbornness of a person who has not yet found a variable she believes is actually final. The pulling sensation in my chest had its certainty. I had mine. Then I found the second container. It was in Paula's office, as it turned out. She had found it tucked into a cargo manifest discrepancy she had been quietly tracking for months, a shipment logged as calibration equipment whose mass readouts had flagged as inconsistent with the declared contents. She had pulled it, opened it, determined she could not identify the contents with her available tools, and set it aside pending proper analysis. She had not filed a report about it. She had not told anyone. This is one of the things I came to understand about Paula over the course of our loops together. She kept things. She kept anomalous things especially, not because she was deceptive, but because she had the researcher's instinct that the unexplained data point is always the most important one, and the institutional reporting process had a way of making unexplained data points disappear into committee review. There were 11 capsules in the container. 11 more resets, 11 more loops. I want to be honest about what that felt like, standing in her office holding that container. I want to say it felt like hope, and in some practical sense it did. It extended the window. It gave me 11 more tries. But I was also, in the same moment, doing the arithmetic on the other side of the equation, and the arithmetic was not reassuring. 11 loops at 7 days each is 77 days of operational window, spread across weeks of calendar time. 77 days is not enough time to solve a problem that no one has ever solved, using equipment that was not designed for the purpose, in a facility whose director had every administrative reason to impede rather than assist. The math said I was going to die. Paula said, then we change what we're trying to solve. She said it the way she said most things, quietly, without drama, with the particular confidence of someone who has thought the problem through to a place she did not expect to arrive and has decided to trust the arrival. She sat at her workstation and she pulled up the resonance maps and she said, "We've been working on extraction. We've been assuming that the solution has to be removing the seed. What if removal is the wrong frame entirely? What if the right frame is propagation termination? I stared at her. Propagation termination. Not removing the seed. Not revering what the cascade had done. Not extracting a micro-singularity from inside a human body, which was an engineering problem I had been unable to solve because it was, as far as I could determine, impossible with available technology. Stopping the seed from growing. Not fighting the singularity's accretion cycle, denying it what it needed to run. She walked me through the physics. The thing about a micro-singularity is that it feeds on density differential. It accretes because it is denser than the surrounding matter, and the surrounding matter falls toward it the way water falls toward a drain. But the accretion cycle requires a specific minimum threshold of ambient matter density to sustain itself. The differential has to be above a certain value, or the gravitational gradient is too shallow to drive meaningful accretion. Below that threshold, the cycle slows. Below a lower threshold still, it stops. The singularity does not disappear. It sits there, frozen at whatever mass it has already accumulated, unable to grow, waiting for conditions that never return. The human body has very limited control over its own matter density. But the exotic matter containment lattice on Aethon's exterior array, the same lattice that had seeded the parasite in the first place, was capable of generating a localized spacetime compression field. It had been built for that exact purpose, and a compression field, properly inverted, could theoretically produce a localized decompression zone, a region of reduced effective matter density around a specific target. A zone that, if calibrated precisely enough, might drop the ambient density at my chest cavity below the accretion threshold. It would not remove the seed. I would carry it for the rest of my life, but it would not kill me. A contained gravitational anomaly, which was, as it happened, the precise language on my original discharge form. The irony was not lost on me. The doctors had called it contained because they did not yet know it was growing. I was going to make them accidentally correct. The problem was the calibration. The exterior array had never been used for targeted decompression. It had been built for containment applications on a much larger scale. Repurposing it for a biological target would require a reconfiguration of the field emitters at a level of precision that the station's existing control software was not designed to manage, using targeting calculations that had never been tested against living tissue, operated by a team of 2 in a research bay that was not remotely rated for exotic matter applications. The margin for error was approximately the width of a millimeter in the field boundary placement, and 0 everywhere else. It would also require the cooperation of Director Halst, who controlled access to the exterior array. I will tell you about Halst because he matters. He was not a villain, which in some ways made him harder to deal with than a villain would have been. A villain has clear motivations and predictable behavior. Halst was a competent administrator who had made a series of decisions that each seemed defensible in isolation and collectively amounted to a catastrophe. He had pushed the containment lattice past its rated capacity because the project had a funding review deadline, and the preliminary results had been genuinely extraordinary. The kind of results that appear once in a decade in exotic matter research, and that make the people who produce them believe, not unreasonably, that the normal rules of risk management do not quite apply to them. He had dismissed my resonance irregularity report because it had not specified a failure mode, only a general instability flag, and in his cost-benefit analysis, a flag without a specific failure prediction did not justify a delay that would push the project past the funding review. He had not intended to seed a gravitational parasite in the chest of one of his researchers. He had not intended for any of it. He was genuinely distressed in the early loops when I observed him closely enough to read his distress by what had happened to me. That distress was real. It did not override the other thing, which was a profound institutional self-protectiveness that had calcified over 20 years of navigating budget committees and oversight boards, a quality that made him respond to any threat to the project or his management of it with a reflexive defensiveness that looked, from the outside, exactly like indifference. He was not indifferent, he was afraid. There is a difference, and it matters for how you approach the conversation. You cannot come at a man like that from the front. From the front, everything is a threat. Every piece of information you bring him is ammunition for a proceeding he is already anticipating, and his response to ammunition is to build walls. You have to come at him from the side. I spent 3 loops learning that. On loop 41, I had my first conversation with him that made actual progress. Not about the array, not about the anomaly, not directly. I had done the calculation by then, and I understood that any approach that led with my physical situation, any version of me walking into his office and saying your negligence seeded a parasite in my chest, and I need your array to stop it from killing me, would trigger the defensive response before I had finished the sentence. He would express sympathy. He would refer me to the medical board. He would convene a preliminary review panel. He would consume my 7 days in procedural process without ever being required to make a real decision about anything. Instead, I went to him with Paula's theoretical framework. I went to him with the resonance maps and the propagation termination concept, and a cold clinical presentation I had been refining across 3 loops, and I presented it not as a rescue operation, but as a breakthrough in applied quantum mechanics. I presented it as the logical extension of everything his project had been working toward. The moment when the exotic matter containment research produced an application with implications beyond the laboratory. I presented it as the experiment that would validate everything. I told him the targeted decompression protocol was going to generate results that would make the funding committee's review irrelevant, because the board would be too busy processing the implications to ask questions about operating margins. He listened for 40 minutes without interrupting me. That itself told me something. In all my loops of watching him, I had not seen him give anyone 40 minutes of uninterrupted attention. Then he said, "If the calibration fails, we could collapse the lattice." I said, "Yes." He said, "The liability exposure in that scenario." I said, "The liability exposure of the current situation is somewhat more significant than a lattice collapse. I have a complete readout of my medical file, including the date of the initial seeding event and the maintenance log entry from that corridor at that time, and I am prepared to share it with the board at my discretion." A long pause. "Dr. Voss," he said, "are you threatening me?" I said, "I am presenting you with a variable you may not have fully weighted in your analysis." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "What is the timeline?" I told him, 4 days for the calibration work, with unrestricted access to the array control suite for 48 continuous hours minimum. He said he would consider it. He did not consider it in time. I ran out of window on day 6 of that loop. He had been sitting in his office considering it, running his own calculations, weighing his own variables when I died. Loop 42. I came back in and went directly to his office, and I did not give him the 40-minute presentation. I had already given it. I gave him the condensed version in 8 minutes, handed him a written brief I had prepared during the previous loop, and I told him I had been advised by independent legal counsel to document this conversation and all subsequent conversations related to the incident. That was not true. I did not have legal counsel. I did have a complete, time-stamped communication log that I had been building across several loops, and the suggestion of lawyers was enough. He authorized array access by end of that day. We had 5 days. Paula had the reconfiguration specs already partially developed because I had spent the relevant sections of Loop 41 working through them with her and had committed the sequence to memory. She was startled, in Loop 42, by how much I already knew, by how precisely I anticipated steps she had not yet named, by how often I arrived at her conclusions before she finished statting the premise. I told her I had done extensive reading. She looked at me with an expression I had come to recognize over the loops, a particular careful stillness, as though she was running numbers on something she was not ready to say aloud. I did not explain the loops to her, not then. Part of it was practical. Explaining the loops consumed time I did not have, and in every version I had rehearsed, the explanation produced a reaction that added hours I needed for actual work. Shock, then skepticism, then a sustained period of questions that were completely reasonable and completely burning the clock. Part of it was something harder to name, a reluctance to put what I had been carrying for 41 iterations onto the shoulders of a 26-year-old who was still building the architecture of her own career, and who was, in this loop, genuinely excited about what we were doing. She had the energy of someone who believed they were making a discovery. I did not want to replace that with the specific grief of knowing that the discovery had already failed 12 times. I let her have the discovery. I let her believe we were working on a fresh idea. I carried the iterations alone and gave her the clean version. That was, I think, the most human thing I did in any of those 55 loops. Not the stubbornness, not the refusal to die on schedule, not the equations or the calibrations or the arguments with Halst. The decision to protect someone else's sense of possibility when I could easily have weaponized her pity. It may also have been the decision that saved my life. Because Paula, working from what she understood to be a first attempt framework, found a flaw in loop 43 that I had missed. Not a flaw in the fundamental concept, a flaw in the targeting model, a resonance interference pattern in the decompression field boundary that my memorized parameters had not accounted for. The parameters I was working from had been derived from theoretical simulation. Paula, working fresh with no assumption that the simulation was correct, had run them against the actual current array diagnostics and found a discrepancy. It was small. 0.003% deviation in the decompression field boundary calculation at the interface between the primary and secondary emitter zones. Small enough that I had not caught it in loop 42. Large enough that, at the moment of activation, it would have produced a field boundary overlap at the cardiac interface. The overlap would have generated a sympathetic resonance cascade in the singularity itself. The cascade would have accelerated the accretion cycle by a factor of approximately 800. It would have killed me in 4 seconds instead of 5 days. I sat with that for a long time after she showed me the numbers. I sat with the precise understanding of how close I had been, how the certainty I had built across 42 loops of accumulated knowledge had almost become the thing that finished me. I had been so certain. The simulation had been right. My memory of the simulation had been right. The actual array, operating in actual conditions with actual entropy and actual manufacturing tolerances in the emitter housings, had had a different opinion. The universe was not going to let me win by being certain. I had to keep being wrong. After that, I told her about the loops. She did not react the way I expected. I had run through 17 different versions of telling her across various loops, some early, some late, some never, and I had a reasonably good sense of the range of responses. Most of them involved shock. Most of them involved a period of destabilization. She sat back in her chair and looked at me for a measured moment and said, "How many?" I said 43, more or less. She said, "And the capsule resets your physical state but not your memory." I said, "Yes." She said, "So every loop, you know everything you've learned in every previous loop, but your body doesn't. Your body keeps starting over." I said, "Yes." She was quiet for another moment. Then, "That means you're the only long-term data point in a 50-iteration experiment. You are the experiment." I had not thought about it that way. I had been thinking of myself as the problem to be solved, the patient, the subject, the thing the experiment was meant to fix. She was reframing me as the instrument, the one continuous variable across 50 iterations. the thing the universe had failed to account for. She pulled up her analysis suite without another word. She said, "Then we should be using your accumulated data more systematically. You've been doing this by memory, but memory has bias and compression artifacts. You're going to misremember details across that many iterations without even knowing it. Let me build you a logging framework." 26 years old. She built me a logging framework in 2 hours. Structured, cross-referenced, designed to capture not just the numerical parameters but the physical conditions of each array test, the environmental variables, the timing of each step. It was the kind of framework a senior researcher would have been proud of. I used it for the remaining 12 loops. The flaw correction took 3 of them. Paula found 2 more interference patterns on subsequent iterations, different ones each time, because the physical conditions of each loop were not precisely identical. Entropy does not reset when you do. The emitter housings had minute variations in thermal expansion that changed their resonance profile depending on what temperature the array was at when we started the calibration. The atmospheric processor in the control suite had a maintenance cycle that introduced a vibration pattern into the deck plating at irregular intervals that was too small to register on normal sensors, but not too small to affect field boundary precision at the scale we were working at. There was always something. There was always one more thing the simulation had not included, because the simulation did not have to live in a real station with real equipment and real entropy working against it. Each loop, I came back in with the corrected parameters, and she found something new to verify. This is the thing about solving a problem that has never been solved before. You do not solve it by being right. You solve it by being wrong in progressively smaller ways, loop by loop, until the remaining wrongness is small enough that the thing actually works. On loop 54, we ran the full simulation. Complete array calibration, targeted decompression field, biological interface locked to my chest cavity at the coordinates we had spent 12 loops refining, propagation termination protocol engaged. The simulation returned stable containment. Singularity mass frozen at current accumulation, non-accreting, resonance half-life approximately 40 years. I would carry it for the rest of my life. I would never be free of it, but it would not kill me. I went back to my quarters that night, loop 54, day 5, the station at 100 and the corridors quiet, and I did not go over the numbers again. I had gone over the numbers. I sat at the porthole with the orange glow of the refinery platforms shifting slowly against the dark, and I thought about other things. My husband was asleep. My daughter had played piano that afternoon in the common room, the same piece I had heard 54 times, the same hesitation before the difficult passage, the same correction after the stumble. I had sat in the common room and listened to every note. I had thought, sitting there the first several times, that repetition would hollow it out, that knowing the stumble was coming would flatten it into procedure, that 54 hearings of the same music would turn it into something I could process and set aside. It had not. I could not explain that. I had sat there on the 54th hearing and felt it the same way I had felt it on the first, the specific quality of attention that a parent brings to watching a child try to do something hard, that combination of pride and helplessness that has no name. It was still her hands on the keys. It was still her deciding, every time, whether to go on. I thought about that in the dark for a long time. On loop 55, I got up at 500. Paula was already in the research wing when I arrived, which did not surprise me. She had been early every loop once we were inside the final calibration phase. She did not sleep well when she was close to something. Neither did I. I had brought 2 cups of coffee from the dispensary, bad ones, burnt and slightly sour the way the station dispensary always produced them regardless of any adjustment to the settings. I handed her one. She took it without looking up from her workstation. We went through the parameters together, every figure, every boundary condition, every resonance interference pattern we had identified across the previous 12 loops, cross-referenced against the current array diagnostics, verified 3 separate times with 3 separate methods. It took 4 hours and 20 minutes. By the end, we had both memorized everything. Not because I had asked her to memorize it, but because that is what happens when you go through something carefully enough. It becomes part of you. At 1100 station time, we went to the array control suite. Halst was there. He had brought 2 of his senior technical staff, which was more witnesses than I wanted and fewer than I had feared. He stood at the back of the suite with his arms crossed and his expression arranged into something that was trying to be the authority and presence of a project director overseeing a controlled experiment, and kept sliding toward the expression of a man who understood, in a way he had been successfully avoiding until this moment, what was actually at stake. I did not look at him after the initial acknowledgement. I did not have the attention to spare. The exterior array emitter housings were visible through the hull feed cameras on the monitors along the right wall of the suite. I watched them through those cameras as Paula ran the reconfiguration sequence. The process was slow and methodical. Each emitter stepped through its new configuration one by one, the field geometry building from one end of the array to the other like a structure being assembled. She did not rush. She did not narrate. She had run this sequence 13 times in simulation and twice in controlled partial array tests during the preceding loops, and it showed. Her hands were steady. I have worked with a lot of researchers over 31 years, and I know the difference between someone executing a procedure they have memorized and someone who has made the procedure part of how they think. She had made it part of how she thought. The reconfiguration took 94 minutes. Then we moved to the targeting lock. This was the step I had been afraid of since the first loop we had conceived it, because targeting a decompression field at a biological structure is not a process that accommodates approximation. The field boundary placement had to be exact to within a fraction of a millimeter. Too wide and the boundary intersected the cardiac tissue at the interference coordinates that Paula had identified in loop 43. The resonance cascade, the acceleration, the 4-second outcome. Too narrow and the Singularity sat outside the decompression zone and continued accreting on schedule. The margin was not generous. The margin was the difference between a solution and a faster death. I sat in the targeting chair, a modified maintenance couch that had been moved into the suite for the purpose, not designed for extended occupancy, padded inadequately for someone who was going to have to hold absolutely still for 20+ minutes. I did not move. Paula ran the lock sequence from her workstation, adjusting the field boundary parameters in real time, reading the sensor returns from the diagnostic array we had positioned across my chest cavity. The process required continuous micro-adjustments as the field settled toward its final configuration, each adjustment smaller than the last, converging on the target coordinates. It took 22 minutes. I know because I counted seconds. Not because counting was useful. It was not useful for anything. But because it was something my mind could do that did not involve thinking about the field boundary coordinates, and whether the interference pattern we had corrected for in loop 47 was fully corrected, or whether some residual artifact was still present in the emitter profile of housing 7, which had shown a 0.01% drift in the final diagnostic that we had calculated was within acceptable tolerance, and which I was still, sitting in that chair in the silence of the control suite with everyone watching monitors, not entirely certain about. At 19 minutes, Paula said, "Boundary locked, resonance return clean, no interference signature in any band." I said, "Check it again." She checked it again. Same result, clean across the full spectrum. Check it a third time. A pause, then, same result, Dr. Voss, 3 for 3, all bands clean. I turned my head carefully, without moving my torso, and looked at Halst. He was looking back at me from the far side of the suite with the expression of a man who has run the numbers on his own situation and arrived at an answer he does not like but cannot dispute. I turned back to the monitors. I said, "Engage propagation termination." Paula engaged propagation termination. The array fired. I felt it in my chest. Not the pulling, not the accretion, not the consuming sensation I had felt at the end of every loop for 55 iterations. Something different. Something that had no prior reference point in any physical sensation I had experienced before. The closest I can come to describing it is this. It was the absence of a sound you had stopped hearing. The way a room changes when a piece of equipment you had stopped registering finally goes quiet, and you understand only in the silence that it had been running all along, that the background had not been silence at all but noise you had adapted to, and now the noise was gone. The singularity was still there. I could feel its mass, a cold, dense presence behind my sternum, heavy and specific, the exact sensation I had felt every loop when the accretion was running. But the accretion was not running. The pulling was not running. The thing in my chest was sitting still. Paula said, stable mass, accretion cycle reading 0 across all sensor returns, resonance signature holding at baseline. The room was quiet for a moment. Halst's senior staff were looking at their monitors with the slightly lost expressions of people who had been expecting something dramatic and had received instead a readout that simply said the number that needed to be 0 was 0. Paula looked at me. I looked at her. I thought about the 11 capsules. I thought about the 43 loops before I found them. I thought about loop 22, when I had tried to access the array by bypassing the authorization process entirely, and had been escorted out of the control suite by station security with 4 days remaining and no plan. I thought about loop 37, when I had been so certain I had the calibration right that I had not asked Paula to verify the boundary coordinates, and had died on day 6 with the procedure 2 hours from completion. I thought about loop 43 and the 4-second version, the one I had been one failed verification away from. I thought about everything I wanted to say, and about how none of it would fit in this room. I said, the notes are on your workstation. Everything, the theoretical framework, the full calibration log, the interference correction data from all 12 iterations of the targeting work, the array reconfiguration parameters. All of it is documented. It needs to go to publication. Paula said, our name's on it. Your name first. She frowned. You did more of the work. You found the flaw that kept the work from killing me, I said. Your name first. That is the correct attribution. She looked at me for a moment. Then she accepted it and turned back to her workstation. Halst said, from the back of the room, in the voice of a man reassembling his professional manner piece by piece, I'll need a full incident report on this entire sequence of events. I turned to face him. You will receive a full incident report, I said. You will also receive a copy of the documentation of every safety irregularity flag submitted in the 18 months prior to the seeding event, a complete reconstruction of the conditions that made the seeding possible, and a formal recommendation to the Station Oversight Board regarding the operating protocols and authorization requirements that need to change before this project resumes at any capacity. I have prepared all of this in advance. It is sitting in the board's secure file queue. The transmission will complete automatically in 6 hours unless I cancel it. The room was very quiet. Hall said, Dr. Voss. I said, I am not interested in destroying you or this project, Director. I am interested in the next person who runs a maintenance check on a secondary array not dying because someone decided that a safety flag without a specific failure prediction was not worth a delay. Those are compatible interests if you choose to make them compatible. He was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded. Once, slowly, with the deliberateness of a man who understands that he has run out of the kind of variables he is accustomed to managing. I left the control suite. I walked back through the research wing, through the cold corridor, past the porthole that looked out on the dark, and the slow orange drift of the refinery platforms against the black of the inner belt. I walked to the common room. My daughter was there. She was sitting at the piano, not playing, just sitting with her hands in her lap and her eyes on the keys, in the particular way she sat when she was trying to convince herself she was not afraid of the difficult passage. I had watched her sit that way 55 times. I knew it the way I knew the whole sounds at 300. I knew it better, in fact. I knew it in the way you know something when you have watched it from the outside, while carrying something the other person did not know you were carrying. I sat down next to her on the bench. She looked at me. I said, "Play it again." She said, "I'll mess it up." I said, "You've been messing it up for months. That's how you learn it." She looked at me for a moment longer. That look children have, reading the thing behind the words, checking the face for the real information. She found whatever she was looking for. She put her hands on the keys. She played it. She stumbled on the difficult passage. The same stumble, the same correction, the same rough landing at the end with her hands lifting from the keys a little uncertainly, not sure whether to be disappointed or satisfied. I sat with the cold, dense presence behind my sternum, the stopped equation, the contained weight that I would carry from this day forward, that I would feel every morning when I woke up and every night when I tried to sleep, that no one else would ever feel because no one else's body would register it as anything other than mine. I thought about the universe that does not register what matters, the equations that run the same whether anyone is watching or not, the physics that does not care about piano lessons or bad coffee or the specific quality of light through a porthole in the small hours. I thought about what it had taken to make the physics stop. Not a weapon, not a bigger array or a stronger field or a more powerful version of the same approach. The thing that had stopped the physics was time, not the capsule's time, not the loop's manufactured window, but the time that had accumulated in my memory while my body kept resetting. 55 iterations of being wrong in progressively smaller ways. 55 chances to find the flaw that would have killed me in a faster and more final way. The universe had one version of the equation, clean and indifferent, and I had 55 drafts of the response, each one built on the failure of the last. The universe had not anticipated a variable like that. The universe does not anticipate. It calculates forward, not backward. It does not revise. It does not iterate. It does not wake up at 500 and go back to the research wing and find the 23rd reason the previous attempt was wrong. Humans do. That is, in the end, the only thing I know for certain that we do which physics does not do. We accumulate our failures. We carry them forward. We refuse, on some level that has no technical explanation, to accept the result the equation has already produced. My daughter sat next to me on the piano bench, picking at a fingernail, waiting for her mother to say something. I said, "That was better than yesterday." It was, it always would be.